Hey, this is Kevin Wallace, and in this week's edition of Forerunners, the Surfline podcast, I'm joined by lead forecasters Jonathan Warren and Schaller Perry to discuss one of the all-time best swells in Southern California, Hurricane Marie from August 2014. We'll break down the surf heights experienced, why Marie was such a special swell, utilizing our perfect storm test, and some of the rare spots that lit up amongst many other things. Also, if you're not yet a premium member and would like to give us a try, which we would greatly appreciate, go to surfline.com/Forerunners podcast for a free 15-day trial of Surfline Premium. Here we go.
Okay, this is Sean Collins, Chief Forecaster of Surfline, and this is, the first order of business, looking down on the Southern Hemisphere, what to expect over the next 2 weeks.
At any given moment, a perfect wave is breaking somewhere on this earth. For the surfer, the trick has always been knowing where and when to find it.
Alrighty, with all the doom and gloom of late, we thought we'd do something a little fun this time around for the Forerunners podcast. We're going to look back at what is most likely the biggest and most consistent tropical swell in the last 25 years at least. And that's Hurricane Marie, which was in late August of 2014. Certainly at the time that the swell from Marie happened, you had to go back at least 15 years, a little bit longer than that, to the El Nino-fueled summer of '97 to find anything close. We had three really great swells that year in Guillermo, Linda, and Nora. I think Marie, in my opinion, I was up close and personal for all those swells. Marie pretty much blew all those out of the water too. So you can make a pretty strong argument that's the biggest tropical swell we've ever seen in Southern California and for most of Northern California as well. We are also relaunching a companion piece with this podcast. It's called Anatomy of a Swell, Hurricane Marie. This is actually an older piece that we did right after the swell happened, but we wanted to give it a little bit of a facelift. So you can see that on the site now, too. You can just do a Google search for Anatomy of a Swell, Hurricane Marie. We've got some bonus features in that, too, that we won't go too deep in on this podcast. That includes a detailed look at the bathymetry of Newport Point, which was one of the hot spots on this swell. 2014 was kind of like the El Ninoest non-El Nino of all year. We had those three really good tropical swells in Lowell, Marie, and Simon. We had really warm water, especially off of Baja and up through Southern California. That warm water helped to intensify those hurricanes and really give us great surf from them. And it's interesting because the previous decade had basically been a bust. A couple fun ones here and there, but you have to go back to around 2002 for anything of the good to epic variety. So as we did on the site with our Anatomy of a Swell, we're going to run through the Surfline Perfect Storm test, which we retroactively perform on these epic swells. And that's where we analyze the storm wind, the storm size, and the storm tracker movement. And we do these for public consumption when we see these epic swells, but we are doing it on a day in and day out basis as a forecast team. We're always looking at all those components, all those variables to determine, how big an upcoming swell is actually going to be. So I'm going to introduce two of my fellow lead forecasters. We've got Schaller Perry, who was actually on the Southern California forecast when Marie was lining up, and we've got John Warren as well, who is infamous for surfing all over Southern California, as many other locations, and surf some pretty unique spots on this Marie swell. Guys, welcome. Thanks for being here. I'm excited to chat about this a little bit.
Yeah, aloha. How's it going?
Yeah, Marie, the one.
Yeah, it's funny. I was thinking right before we started recording this one, in the Atlantic, and I guess all the basins in general, a lot of times you'll see storm names actually be retired if they were particularly destructive. I almost want to say we should retire Marie's name for just being so good for surf here in the Eastern Pacific and
hang it in the rafters.
Yeah, exactly. It's funny that every time the forecast charts point to potentially good hurricane swell, you see all the chatter about, is it going to be a Marie type swell? And almost without fail, I can say it's not going to be close. And it'll be, I think it's going to be a long, long time before we see anything like this again.
Yeah, it's certainly the one that's going to be the one to compare everything else to. Huh.
Yeah, exactly. So just to run through the numbers a little bit more, the swell for Marie came up on Tuesday, August 26th through the afternoon, really started to get pretty serious by the later afternoon and evening hours. And then by Wednesday morning, that's when it generally peaked just about everywhere. And it was just absolutely pumping all the way through the day on Wednesday. To run through some of the kind of at least semi-hot spots to hot spots down through the La Jolla region was in the 6 to 10 foot range with good conditions. North County, San Diego up through Oceanside. How did I say that? That was weird. In the 5 to 10 foot range, fairly good. Trestles is actually kind of maxed out for the most part, especially like lowers kind of a weird direction. Still some good waves, but like the 8 to 12 foot range on the face. Going up to wedge, certainly one of the hot spots in the 15 to 30 foot range and good conditions. Newport Point was absolutely all time. It's the best I've ever seen it. Had lifeguarded there for a number of years in the late 90s, saw some great swells in that 97 summer. And Marie just by far and away, I think was the best Newport Point I've ever seen. You had guys coming over from Hawaii claiming it's like 10-foot pipeline, 10-foot Hawaiian pipeline. Just absolutely going off. HB Pier was in the 8 to 15 foot range. Generally port affair though. You could have if you were super lucky and you didn't get washed up to Seal Beach in a matter of a few minutes after jumping in the water, you might be able to pick something off. Seal Beach had a couple crazy ones in the 8 to 15 foot range too. Long Beach area, believe it or not, Long Beach had some great waves. And I think, John, that's where you surfed, right? Or at least you surfed a little bit in Long Beach?
Yeah. Wednesday was actually my birthday, and I was off, and I was having a great time on this Swell. And yeah, I surfed Marie on Wednesday morning, Long Beach, and it was head high to a couple feet overhead, and just reeling lefts all the way up the beach. Basically, I mean, there was a lot of waves that weren't makeable, but when you could lock into one, you're getting barreled in Long Beach, which is pretty much flat any other day.
Doesn't happen too often.
Yeah. And then beside that, in the afternoon, I went over and I surfed the point off of Cabrillo.
We're gonna have to bleep that out, I think, dude. Bump some people out.
Well, that spot never breaks.
Syringes and then a boat trip.
Yeah, it was actually one of those spots, though, that I'm sure we're gonna get into talking about later. That usually is not all that great, but on certain swell direction, it goes off.
A lot of rare birds this day. Well, continuing north, out Malibu was absolutely all time in the 8 to 12 foot plus range on the face. Probably some bigger sets on top of that too. There were waves that were breaking well outside the pier. Pretty much glassy conditions all day long, and just nonstop waves. Certainly one of the best days at Malibu, I think, in the last 20 to 30 years, if not longer than that. Zuma actually had some crazy ones, 8 to 15 foot range, some wild lefts running through. Getting up into the Santa Barbara zone, believe it or not, you had that south-southeast swell direction sneaking in between the Channel Islands and the mainland. And so spots like Rincon and Sandspit were pretty good too, head high to a little bit overhead. So some crazy waves out there. John, so you surf some kind of secret spots. Sean, where did you surf on this swell?
I surfed the lower streets of Newport, believe it or not, and it was solid. It's funny. There's if you dig through the comment section of the Anatomy of a Swell on the old site, people talking about kind of a wave breaking pretty much a mile and a half offshore of the lower streets, and it was pretty wild to surf down there. Because generally you surf down there during the winter. Shorter period Northwest swells gets really good down there. But to go there and have it be double overhead teepees was pretty wild. I didn't surf. I didn't have the lumber to give the point a go. And it was just, it's shocking to see that much size. Because even on, a long period, solid Southern Hemisphere swell that might be 8 foot plus faces up in kind of the 56 through Huntington Pier zone, there it's generally going to be chest, shoulder high at best. So to see that much size there was pretty wild. And just to see how much water and size was moving kind of laterally up towards West Newport, the Huntington area, that'll be burned in my memory for a while.
Yeah, it's interesting. I didn't see this specifically on the Marie swell, but remember it from a couple of those 97 swells when I was lifeguarding in Newport. And you have you've got Blackies, which is kind of right there by Newport Pier, and it's just really just on the other side of this kind of bend in the coast for people that aren't familiar with the Newport Point and Blackies area. But they're very close. They're a few hundred yards apart, something like that. And as you mentioned, you get this incredible current moving from south to north. And so while Blackies was basically flat on the swell, maybe some little waves starting to wrap in, you had this insane current pushing against the 28th Street jetty there, and just rescues all day, and this rip along the 28th Street jetty, which is insane. But I did the same thing. I ended up surfing the lower streets on this swell. I kind of was all over the place. I was at 56th Street before the sun came up, and it was just overloaded with swell. Ran up to Seal Beach, the river mouth, to check out up there, and it was overloaded with swell. And so ended up coming back down to the lower streets and surfing there all morning. And then I actually gave Newport Point a go in the afternoon when it was a little bit smaller and the crowd wasn't quite as heavy as it was in the morning, because it was not surprisingly, but it was a pretty heavy crowd in the morning, in addition to some just macking, pumping waves.
Yeah.
All right. Sorry, Jim, go ahead.
No, yeah, I was actually, I was off that day, and I was set out to go down and hit the point, or at least have a look at it. And I was like, you know what? I wonder if Long Beach has a wave, like just on paper, seeing the swell direction and the cut that's in the break wall, there's got to be something. And so I went ahead, and just at that time, like right around that time is, I just moved to Long Beach at that moment. And I was like, I got to go check it. I mean, there's only one time ever you're ever going to be able to surf there. So, and this might be that time. And sure enough, I gave that drive and saw waves, and nowhere really to park down there either. So you just had to just pull off on the side of the road and just go. But
yeah, it's crazy. It's like, it's basically like huge hurricane swells or like huge west swells in the winter. That's like the only time you get the little waves sneaking in that Long Beach zone. Definitely
like a novelty. It's I don't know if it's ever going to see that again, because I mean, really, it's when are we going to see Hurricane Maria again? So
you have another 25 to 50 years.
Yeah. You'll still be charging at 65, right?
Maybe.
All right, well, let's jump into our perfect storm test. And as I mentioned, kind of the top of the pod, this is something our forecast team does each and every day with basically any storm that's out there. But for these kind of classic epic swells, it's fun to look back and really dive into it. So again, we're looking at storm wind, we're looking at storm size, we're looking at storm movement. And with tropical swells especially for Southern California, the wind isn't as important as you might think. People get really excited when they hear about a Category 4 or Category 5 storm that's in the Southern California swell window. But if that storm is really moving quickly out to the west, 12 or 15 knots, and is pretty small, you're probably not going to see a whole lot of surf from it. To compare that against something else, sometimes we see like pumping waves from storms that are really very modest in strength. And a great example of this was the swell that hit just a few days before the Marie swell, and that was from Tropical Storm Lowell. It was not a hurricane, but it was a huge storm by tropical standards, and it took a pretty good track too. So, all of these variables we do examine, and they're all really important. And it's kind of the sliding scale on which one is doing what. But in this case, kind of all the elements lined up, and that's obviously why we got this great swell. So we're going to start with storm wind. And John, why don't you take us through the storm wind of Marie?
Yeah, strong.
All right.
Yeah,
cool. Nailed
it. Basically you had the best environment, to see something of this caliber even crank up. You have just super warm sea surface temperatures, very low vertical wind shear, and a whole lot of warm, moist air during the first few days of this thing as it started to whip up and head out to sea from mainland Mexico. And by August 24th, we saw a central low pressure drop to 919 millibars, and and sustained hurricane force winds cranking up to 140 knots, which is just over 160 miles per hour near the center of this thing. And then, also keep in mind that tropical storm force winds extending over 300 miles from the center. But the biggest kicker with this fetch of wind is that the strongest winds were on the eastern side of it, which are the winds that are aimed northward towards Southern California. And to add to that, it was an elongated fetch of over 500 miles from south to north.
Stepping on Schaller's toes here a little bit.
I actually don't have anything to say anymore. You took the words right
just want to hang up, dude?
Yeah, I'm gonna go change some diapers.
But I'm still talking about wind. Sorry about that, Schaller. But yeah, so it's you had all this wind on the eastern side of it, and strong wind. And like I said, like that fetch was over 500 miles long from south to north, aimed up towards Southern California.
Stay in your own yard, John.
But it all ties in. It's all still wind. It's and if you keep in mind that the storm itself was only just over about like 1,000 miles from Southern California. So when you have a fetch over 500 miles long, and I mean, that's roughly half the size of, like that fetch is roughly half of like the distance it is from Southern California. So when you have all that wind aimed towards Southern California, not very far away, that's a whole lot of energy that's going to make its way northward. And that's what we saw.
Yeah, so you referenced the central low pressure, which was 919 millibars, and I think that's what it bottomed out at, if I recall correctly. And I think certainly at the time, and this may still hold true, I'm not positive, but I think it was like the 5th or 6th lowest pressure recorded in the eastern Pacific tropics at that point. And just to give that a little bit of reference, your average sea level pressure on just kind of like an average day in Southern California, sea level pressure, I think is it's like 1012 or 1013 millibars. Is that right? So this is roughly 100 millibars lower than that. That would cause extreme ear popping for sure. If you just dropped 100 millibars of pressure, it's incredibly low and really impressive. All right, Schaller. Well, so storm wind, super strong. We were at I think it topped out at, what was it, John? 140 knots. So it was at least briefly a Category 5 for like 12 hours or something like that, and then it weakened slightly. But in terms of your grade for the storm wind, what are you giving it?
I'm going to give it an A for sure.
All right.
Yeah.
Cool. And then Schaller, you've got storm size, and I mean, John just stepped all over your toes just now. But like, what do you got?
I'll just go ahead and drop the grade. So this is the Cliff Notes version. It's getting an A. Size was impressive. I think it's just storm size is so important for tropical swell production. We see all of these systems that are just these tiny, really strong Category 5 systems almost every season in the Eastern Pacific. A lot of times they'll go from just a tropical depression to a Category 5 in a matter of 36 to 48 hours. And it's kind of gets everybody pretty excited. But the reason they're able to intensify so quickly is because they're relatively small. But Marie, a decent sized storm system, we're talking storm force winds of 34 knot or stronger winds, extend out 100 miles or so from the center of the system. With Marie, we're in the ballpark of 300 miles from the center. So as John was saying, on that eastern side of the storm system, we had this expansive fetch of storm force winds. And it's just really the most, I think it's the most important factor when you start talking about swell production outside of movement. Obviously, if this is something that you'll touch on, but if, say, the system was taking maybe not the most favorable track, that's a ding on it. But I really, for me, looking at Eastern Pacific storm systems, it's all about the size.
Yeah, and can you just give our audience a reference of size? I mean, so like, what's our typical Just garden variety, hurricane size. What would we generally consider like a large size?
So average is around 100 miles from the center. You have storm force winds extending. And then if you go to, say, a larger storm, you're going to see 200 to 300 miles from the center. You're going to see those storm force winds extending. So Marie's up on the upper echelon there. I believe Guillermo noted this in the anatomy of a swell, was had those winds extending out 400 miles from the center. So, not the biggest. So we're not going A plus, but a very impressive size. I think we actually talked about this a couple podcasts ago with the system that just impacted Fiji. And we're looking at the radii in the northeast quadrant of that storm system. I think it was like 275 miles from the center. So it's when you start to see those numbers, it's that's when you really get into the ballpark of something that's going to create significant surf.
Yeah, it's interesting when we talk about size of tropical storms versus and how important it is. You realize, like, when you measure the size of a tropical storm to like kind of just a normal winter frontal low, which delivers the majority of our surf, it's just a fraction of the size of those.
They're so small. It's a blip on the radar especially if you're, say, a storm system that sends significant swell from the southern hemisphere. Like how large you have a fetch that extends, that's storm force winds or 40 knot winds extending as much as 2,500 miles.
Yeah, and they'd also set up like a fetch that it covers a surface area of over 500,000 miles. So it's just crazy.
Yeah, you're extending from LA to New York City with storm force winds, and then with Marie. Looking back at the numbers, like we have a story that'll be coming out pretty shortly talking about the largest southern hemisphere swells of the last 20 years, and the deep water swell size from Marie was nearly double it. The largest South Pacific swell.
Yeah. Well, one of the as we were just saying like before, is one of the biggest things is that it's so much closer. Like those other systems in the South Pac, they're over 5,000 to 7,000 miles away, whereas this, Hurricane Maria was only about 1,000 miles. So it's what it makes up for size compared to those mid-lat storms. It makes up for being nice and close.
Yeah, it's interesting to look at all of those different variables and how everything plays out a little bit. And then, of course, the swell period from tropical storms or tropical cyclones in general is lower than what we see from southern hemisphere swells. Marie was pretty impressive on the front end. I think it built in at 16 to 17 seconds initially, and then end up peaking at around 14 seconds, that's long. That's very long period for a tropical cyclone swell. Your garden variety tropical cyclone swell tends to peak in the 11 to 12 second range. So that's just a function of that size again, and partially the track, but really that size. Where think about those storms that you guys referenced, in the South Pacific, a couple of the other anatomy of a swells we've done over the years, where we did the Code Red Tahiti, and then we did I think each of those big Fiji swells in 2011 and 2012, and you're talking about fetches of 30 knot or greater wind, like the size of Australia or the size of the United States. And so when you have that area, that large a fetch to blow over, you will see much longer periods. And so from those swells, you get peak periods that were in the 20 second range or so, anywhere from 18 to 22 seconds. And that's really important when it's traveling so far from, John, like you mentioned, 5,000 miles away, because those long period swells are going to lose energy or decay much slower than these shorter period swells. That swell from Marie, as powerful as it was, if say, Alaska had been in that swell window, or like British Columbia or something had been in that swell window, and maybe it was. I'd have to go back and look to be sure.
Alaska definitely was.
Yeah, with that much longer travel distance, you would have seen that swell decay quite a bit more, versus these super long period swells that you see coming out of the southern hemisphere. And then, of course, too, when you have a swell that reaches shallow water that's got a very long period, it's going to grow and become a much larger wave height at 20 to 22 seconds than it is at 14 to 15 seconds.
What do you think, Kevin? In less than 30 seconds, a quick explanation for why we see those swells with longer swell periods decay not so rapidly?
Well, you've got energy that's extending much deeper into the ocean or into the water column, and so it just has it's not going to decay as it's more energy that has been transferred from the atmosphere into the ocean essentially, and that allows less decay,
less impediment from other surface obstacles, wind and stuff that can dampen a swell, such as the shorter period, shorter period swells. We see, like, a lot of times we see these southeast hurricane swells move up the coast, shorter in period, like around 10, 11 seconds, but then they have to counter a northwest wind swell that might be similar in period coming down the coast. So, have that longer period, it's able to slide underneath that, come right in.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so we've got an A for storm wind, an A. That's what you give the storm wind, right, John? An A or A plus?
I gave it an A, just straight up A plus. I mean, I would keep the plus on reserve, just because you can always have something stronger, like, say, Hurricane Patricia, which was the strongest hurricane in the East Pac. If that thing was taking a track like Hurricane Marie, we would have seen something even bigger. So I'll leave the plus for that one. So I'm just going to give it a straight A.
All right. So we're going to move. I've got the storm track or the storm movement, and just for reference, the ideal track for a hurricane to produce very large surf in Southern California would be once it moves into our swell window, which you need to cross about 110 degrees west, which is kind of, that's roughly south of Cabo. It depends on, how far south the storm is too. But once you get past 110 degrees west, that's generally into the Southern California swell window. And once that happens, you want to see a storm that's moving towards us. So essentially straight north. Now, you also want to see a storm that's moving slow to maximize that swell production and swell potential. So, in a perfect world, you would have a storm moving at straight north, roughly 350, 360 degrees, depending on the exact location. You'd want it to be moving on the slower side, a couple knots to a few knots, something like that. But really any storm that's moving 10 knots or less and is on a general more northwesterly track is going to be pretty good for Southern California. And that's what Marie was. It started off when it was further south. It was on a more of a west to west-northwest track. It was relatively slow, that around 10 to 12 knots. It's being steered by that kind of the mid-latitude, mid-level high, which tends to steer our tropical cyclones. And generally speaking, especially earlier in the season, June and July, most of those storms are moving straight out to the west, and a lot of times they're moving really quickly. As you start to see some weaknesses in that ridge, usually a little bit later in the season, not necessarily always August, but September, and especially getting in October, that's when you see the storms tend to go on more of a northerly track and even recurve back to the northeast. A lot of times you see more landfalling hurricanes over Baja in later September and October than any other time of the year. And in this case, it was a good mixture of both. You had this big storm, really strong. You obviously don't want it to hit land anywhere because the devastation would have been high. But you're also looking for surf, of course. And in this case, after just as the storm was just starting to weaken just a little bit. It peaked, I think, on the 24th or so. Was it the 24th that it peaked in intensity, John, I think, as a Cat 5?
Sunday, 24th. Yeah.
Yeah. And so at that point, it was still kind of tracking more west-northwest, but right as it started to weaken just a little bit is when we saw that ridge weaken too. And so it was able to take on a more northwesterly track, also slowed down a little bit to around 10 knots. So I wouldn't classify it as a great track, but I would classify it as a pretty good track. And on the rating we gave on the site was an A minus. It was moving pretty slow. It was on a favorable track, And it was far enough south too that it stayed over super warm water. So while the storm was weakening a little bit, it was still a Category 4 hurricane. It was still really large, as we mentioned too. So it was it was a very positive factor. I remember when we were, of course, when the three of us were looking at this forecast 6-ish years ago, just not quite there. I think all of us were pretty excited and lighting up, and I think Keaton had just started, right? If I remember correctly. And because we would do our daily briefs, and especially with these hurricanes, it was Keaton Browning, who's one of the forecasters, full-time forecasters on the team now. Went through a pretty extensive training process, and as part of that, this is what we'd talk about these types of storms every day. Hey, what do we like about this thing? What don't we like? And I just remember trying to nitpick things that I didn't like and was not coming up with much.
Yeah.
No, I mean, it's such an impressive storm system. It's definitely one of those ones where am I okay? Really? All right.
Yeah.
This is going to happen.
This thing's for real.
Pretty much checked all the boxes. Kevin, I have a quick question for you.
Sure.
It's so what is the pros and cons, or more so of a con, of when a hurricane stalls? So going back to what you were saying about, you want to see a slow moving hurricane, but you don't really want one to stall too much, at least for a while. Why is that?
Well, I'm not quite sure where you're going with this, to tell you the truth. But so I guess if it's stalled, it wasn't inside our swell window, that wouldn't be great. But if the hurricane had moved into our swell window and had basically stalled out, we're going to get pretty good surf from it.
Are you hunting for upwelling of cooler water?
Oh,
Charlotte gets it. Ding.
There we go.
You want it. I mean, if it stalls, that's a good thing, but then that you're probably going to see the demise of the system, and soon after your swell is going to fade. So if you want it to be a long lasting, you want it to continue to keep moving and staying over that warm water, so it can continue to have that fuel. Otherwise, just like what Schaller said, you get the upwelling, the cooler water comes to the surface and starts to downgrade the system. And what is it when we see these systems, when they start to weaken? What's the thing that old Sean Collins used to always tell us about when you start to see a system?
Oh, it's when it starts to shear apart. Actually,
shear apart. Wind lifts off the surface.
Yeah, that was Sean's contention and I've seen pretty decent proof of that. And this is funny. It's funny. This was the thing that I really remember most about going over with Sean over the years, or certainly one of the top couple, was these hurricane swells. I think are really tough to accurately forecast, and I think we've gotten better over the years. And I think swell model guidance has gotten better over the years, but especially when I first started, the first few years I was at Surfline, 2000 to 2005 or so, they were tough. Like, the models really struggled with them, and Sean had such a good eye for these storms and could just recognize all these variables that we just talked about. And he could do so just by looking at satellite imagery, and he had so much practice doing it. I mean, I do remember that 2002 year when we had several good hurricane swells that I felt like I was finally starting to get it just a little bit, and just practice. But that's a very fond memory I have of Sean, is just going and being like, hey, can we go over this? And he'd get excited about it too, because some of his spots would get good, and it's pretty funny.
Kevin, correct me if I'm wrong, but also back in the day, wasn't there a lot less data on the hurricanes in the East Pac, say, compared to the Atlantic? Because since
that's still the case.
Yeah,
really,
because it's off Mexico and it's moving away, so people tend to care less, and they send less airplanes to check it out and whatnot.
Yeah, exactly. It's pretty rare that we'll get one of those hurricane hunter aircrafts going over a storm, unless it's a major system expected to make landfall. But otherwise, it's a guessing game still. And I think hats off to the National Hurricane Center. I think they generally do a great job of intensity forecasts and track and everything like that. But you're flying blind a lot compared to the Atlantic. You're not getting a lot of that information in the storms because you don't have those hurricane hunter aircrafts going over them. And then it's just a big void in terms of tracking swell too, from southern Baja, northern mainland Mexico, up into Southern California. That has improved, of course. Like, we have more reports, we have more cameras in southern Baja, but from the Cabo area up to Southern California, it's basically just a big desert too. And unless someone's going down there, somewhere down in Central Baja or something like that, it's pretty tough to get any sort of read on the swell. And so whenever we had somebody going down somewhere roughly in the middle, we won't specify where, but to get that type of reporting from those people that were down there was just invaluable in terms of timing and things like that. Because these just such a slight shift in track from a tropical cyclone, a hurricane, whatever, in the Eastern Pacific, slight shift in track or intensity, or not necessarily intensity in track, or in size, if it expands or contracts really quickly. We'll get 6-hour swells here all the time. And right now the East Coast guys are laughing at us because that happens all the time there. And we're complaining about it, but it's,
I definitely don't want to say it's any harder or easier, but I would say, actually, in a nutshell, not just to add, basically to add on to what you're, not only is there less observations, you don't have like the people down there send you a report. You have less hurricane hunters going through it, so you don't have these observations that obviously we're much better now with it, compared to the Atlantic. But I would say overall, like, I also think they're a little trickier, because in the Atlantic, a lot of times they're heading towards you, and
totally.
Whereas here, it's kind of tricky to forecast because they're moving away. So you're trying to forecast what's being spun off the backside of these things. And that in its own right can make these things for California and the West Coast really hard to forecast,
it's a combination of all of the elements. You have to have a little of this, a little of that. And that's why we have this perfect storm test. But most run-of-the-mill tropical systems aren't ticking all of the boxes. You get kind of partial credit here, a little bit there, and it's I think that's part of maybe the art in forecasting some of these events for especially Southern California. And it's fun, but man, they can absolutely it's like if you're on Southern California, you get burned once a year.
Yeah,
like where you just everything looks good, and then it's maybe you don't even get fully burned, but you get a 6-hour window instead of a day and a half of solid surf, because as Kevin, you mentioned, you see the storm system, the wind field expand a little bit, and you just get a wobble that's more northerly for 12 hours, and you'll actually see it in the surf here. It's so wild to actually see that just moment where you see the storm system get a little bit stronger, take a little bit better track for just a short period. And it makes a substantial difference in the surf that we have. And you get this nice pulse that's 6-8 hours long. It'll be an afternoon or a morning, and then it's the taps just shut off on it.
Yeah, we're lucky if it's a morning even.
And that's actually like one, like the trickiest is not just is it a short window, but forecasting exactly when that window is going to be. I just remember, in like my first years as a surf forecaster on the West Coast, and I had a chance to track one of these things. I was on the forecast for Southern California, and I went down to the beach when it was supposed to be there, and it wasn't, and it was like pretty much flat still, and I was like, oh man, I blew it. But it did come, but it came like 6 hours later. It came in the afternoon when I thought it was gonna be in the morning. So it's trying to pinpoint when that little window is going to be is part of that trip.
Yeah, They're always super fun when there's no other swell running, and it's gonna, it's the swell's supposed to fill in overnight, and it goes basically from flat to like whatever 6 to 8 or 6 to 10 feet the next morning. You're just holding your breath overnight, just checking buoys, like where is it? Where is it? Come on!
Yeah,
When
it's
you
always nice to
don't
have
see
that.
anything on the buoy at
I'm
12:30, there's not even like a little bit of
Yeah.
southeast swell on the buoy, and you're just like,
Yeah. Damn it!
especially when
then you
kind
wake
of wish
up
we
and
had
it's
some
pumping, and you're like, oh, this is perfect. And sometimes it doesn't
Uh,
work out that way, but God, it feels good when it does.
It'd be so much more convenient if we had some buoys off Mexico.
oh yeah. All right. Well, let's jump. I'll just quickly hit on winds and conditions. They were great. Basically, that's the long and short of it. It was hot. We were under the influence of high pressure. It was that Wednesday. It was clean pretty much all day at a lot of spots. We had real light offshore wind in the morning, and then it kind of went lightly onshore in the afternoon. But with that much swell, it didn't matter. Like it was just clean at a lot of spots. So great conditions, pumping swell. The last thing I want to touch on, and we hit on this a little bit earlier, was just the unique direction of this particular swell. And we see this a lot with tropical swells is they are, believe it or not, out of the southeast. I know it sounds somewhat counterintuitive to have a swell with any east in it in on the west coast in California. But we do see that, and John, I know you've done a couple of forecaster blogs on swell direction and swell windows for Southern California. How is it possible that we get a swell with some east in it?
Yeah. Well, if you look at a globe, you can see that North America through Mexico all the way down to Central America sweeps back towards the east, and the bight of Southern California faces to the southwest, and like generally faces to the southwest. You have areas that face straight south, such as Santa Barbara. In fact, Santa Barbara would be unreal on hurricane swells all the time if it didn't have the Channel Islands out there. So yeah, it basically, in a short answer, the landmass sweeps back towards the east. Straight south heads straight out in the ocean. So you have this little sliver of a window. If you take into account the Horn of Baja to straight south, you're basically going from 156 degrees southeast to 180 degrees. So that's your southeast window right there between those two. And also, as those swells move northward, so we have that window in the ocean. Now, how it gets into pretty much everywhere along the coast is that swells propagate and they ring out as they move through the water. So they bend and they turn and they wrap in, and then of course then you have the local bathymetry that we kind of spoke about earlier, especially up in North Orange County, that is very conducive for pulling in those swells straight into certain breaks more so than others.
Boy, and I think this direction, because it was unique, there were some really, obviously the swell direction was unique, but and the size was pretty crazy. We were marveling at a couple of the buoy readings yesterday. I pulled up a screenshot that I took of I think it was the St. Clemente Basin buoy when the swell was peaking. It was over 10 feet of swell out of the southeast at 14 seconds, which is pretty incredible. The story that Schaller referenced earlier about the top 5 largest Southern Hemisphere swells of the last 20 years, the top one would just crack 7 feet, and all the other ones were kind of in the 5 to 6 foot range. We're looking at a deep water swell height, while it was a little bit shorter period, of course, that was roughly double all of those largest Southern Hemisphere swells of the last 20 plus years or so. So it was cool to see just these unique spots light up. Obviously, we had Newport Point that lit up, and it's specifically kind of tailored, engineered for those hurricane swells, and gets really good. And I would highly encourage those of you that are interested in a little bit deeper dive on Newport Point to check out the article on the site. John does a really awesome write-up of the bathymetry of Newport Point and why it got so good on this swell. So it's cool to check out. It doesn't really translate that well to the podcast, but when you can see some of the charts that John put together, it's really neat. And yeah, John, like your mention of Long Beach, John, some of the Santa Barbara spots, all these little weird nooks and crannies where swells got in. That there was a pier on Catalina near the Boy Scout camp, kind of that's basically out west out of Avalon, that got taken out where the surf's normally flat, and it was it was like 6 to 8 feet on the swell. Just kind of crazy things. Do you guys have? Is there one spot in particular that really stands out to you on like like, wow, I can't believe that spot got that good or that big or anything?
Sandbar, Santa Barbara.
Yeah.
That that came through that. There's like one video clip where a guy got like a 3-second, not 3 second, like a 3-section just drainer. There's like a big chandelier, and then it just kept going, and it was really hard to believe.
Yeah, that I would have to echo that. That was the one spot. And like I said, like before in like the beginning, I was off that day, and I'm kicking myself for not driving up there, because on paper it makes sense. But
you remember hearing about that, Kevin?
No, of course not. John, like kicking no.
It was like, because that's like my favorite. That's one of my favorite waves there, like Southern California when it's on, and it doesn't really ever turn on in the summer. It's always flat. And but like we were saying, with that southeast angle and with that size, because there's other southeast swells, they don't quite make it enough through the nooks and crannies to get up there. Really, so like the nooks and crannies that like we're talking about is basically shooting behind the Channel Islands. So between the mainland and the Channel Islands, and like there's a sliver of a channel for it to fit through if it has enough size. And Hurricane Marie, obviously, as we know, had enough size, so it was able to get in there with great waves. It just slid right behind the Channel Islands and right up in there. Whereas, like I said, most of the time on hurricane swells or all summer, it's just flat. It's blocked by anything from the south. But that southeast angle, that real sharp angle, was able to sneak in there.
Yeah, the one that stands out to me, we ran a photo of it in our coverage of Marie after the fact. I think we just identified it as, I think we might call it Northern LA County in the photo, but I believe it's actually, I'm pretty sure it's Southern Ventura County. But just some of those, like if you get north of LA, but not quite up to Magoo, it's really kind of a cool stretch of coast up along there. It's like a moonscape almost. And there's these weird little points and places up there that are flat, like, I don't know, 355 days a year, probably.
A lot more likely to see those places in a car commercial than a surf photo.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And they're just like these crazy reeling lefts up there. And I remember seeing it and having driven by that spot. There's a camp, it's not a secret spot by any means. It's not a spot really. It doesn't really break, but there's like a campground right on the beach there. And we're just like, whoa, is that where I think it is? And just seeing stuff like that, hearing about the waves on Catalina, hearing about some of the waves like up in Northern California too, that like just, hardly ever get good on South Swells. And
there are a couple of unicorns on the Central Coast that I've heard about.
Yeah, well, special swell. Hopefully, we'll see one again in our lifetime. We'll see. I'm the oldest of the bunch, so you guys might have to fly the flag for that one. I could be gone and dusted, but we'll see. It'd be fun to see another Marie type swell before it's all said and done. Anything else that we're missing before we sign off here, boys?
Yeah, besides Sandspit, I have to say Long Beach. Long Beach, I mean, come on. It's always flat. So that one definitely had me probably more shocked than Sandspit, just because it's always a lake there and not
unicorns do exist, John.
All over. Cool. Special swell. It's fun to talk about again. And we'll wrap it up here because we're going a little bit long. You guys, anything to plug, anything to mention before we drop off?
I think one of the ones we should do in the future is Pam. That'll be a good one to wrap on.
Oh yeah. The Southern Hemisphere, Southwest Pacific one that spawned the surf all over the place. Yeah, that would be pretty cool. A good idea.
That was a good AOS. That was a terrifying time to be in Puerto Escondido, I'll tell you that much.
But that was extra tropical, so it was a cyclone turned extra tropical, and that's what we're discussing earlier in the podcast about those mid-lat storms compared to tropical systems. We talked about that one that was both.
Yeah. All righty. Well, thanks guys for joining. It was fun to reminisce a little bit and dive back into some of the numbers and just be impressed all over again, have the mind blown all over again. Be safe to everyone that's listening. We do thank you for listening to the podcast. Of course, if you'd like to become a premium subscriber, you can go to Forerunners podcast. Surfline.com/Forerunners podcast. There we go. Otherwise, be safe, be good, and we'll talk again next week.
Yeah. Aloha.
Later, boys.
Thanks for listening to the latest episode of Forerunners, a Surfline podcast. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Just hit the red button below or the Surfline logo in the bottom right and let us know what you think in the comments below as well. Might even answer back in a future podcast. If you're not yet a premium member, just click on the icon in the bottom left for a free 15-day trial of Surfline Premium, as we would love to earn your business. Be safe, be good to each other, and we'll talk again next week.